Hello, my name is Leslie Anderson. I'm the Chief Curator here at the National Nordic Museum. Welcome to What is Nordic Design Norway? I want to thank first the Nordic Culture Fund and Arts Fund for their support of this program series. Its intent was really to provide an introduction to Nordic design, also to examine the idea of national versus pan-Nordic design through 5 programs, and this is the last of this 5-part series. So if you've joined us for the other 4, this is worth the wait, I promise you. If you haven't, the other episodes or other programs are available online on our YouTube channel. It's also an opportunity to connect design historians, curators of design, directors of design museums, and other thought leaders in this area from the Nordic countries and the United States. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our special guest speaker, Morten Spjøtvold. Morten is a Norwegian art historian and curator of design at Kode Bergen, where he oversees the museum's collection of glass, furniture, and metal. He has previously worked as a curator at the Museum of Decorative Arts in Trondheim and specializes in Art Nouveau and 19th century decorative arts. Spjøtvold has published several articles on these topics and is currently working on a study on Norwegian silver made for the tourist market around 1900. Please give a warm welcome to Morten Spjøtvold.
Okay, thank you very much for that generous introduction, Leslie. First and foremost, I would like to express my gratitude to the National Nordic Museum for their invitation to hold this lecture. It is such a great honor for me to have the chance to visit both Seattle and this wonderful museum for the very first time. And of course, when one gets an invitation such as these, one becomes extremely flattered, but also very anxious. Because I'm going to speak about a very broad topic within a very limited time frame. So it's going to be a bit selective presentation of Norwegian design history. I do not intend to give you a full picture of the development over 150 years, but I have structured the presentation around 10 objects from my museum's collection. Some of these are well-established icons, maybe some known to some of you already. Others are less known and less canonized by design historians. But the thing they have in common is that they represent some broader tendencies within the field of design. Of course, other stories, other objects could have been chosen. These are just some extracts of the myriads of histories that constitute the phenomenon of Norwegian design. But hopefully I can inspire you to acquire more deep, in-depth knowledge about this subject, which has become much more accessible to an English-speaking audience over the last couple of years due to a group of very active design researchers connected to the University of Oslo. I will gladly recommend you to dive into their research if you are interested. But before we begin, I would like to introduce you to the institution I represent here today, Kode Museum of Arts, Crafts, Design and Music in Bergen, where I was appointed curator of Dec Arts 2.5 years ago. And Kode is a relatively new museum. It was established in 2007 by merging 7 previous independent museums in the Bergen area. Among these, the West Norway Museum of Decorative Arts, which you can see here, which was founded in 1887. Our collection consists of approximately 60,000 objects, and 2/3 of them can be classified as crafts and design, ranging from ancient Chinese vases to Renaissance silver, 20th century furniture, and contemporary jewelry. But enough about me. Let's start with going back to the mid-19th century, and the first object I would like to introduce for you today, which you can see here on the screen, a cake basket consisting of irregular flower ornaments in pressed silver. It is made by a Bergen goldsmith called Christian Børsch in 1848, and despite the object's relative conservative appearance in Neo-Rococo style, it exemplifies a period of great social and economic change in Norway in the mid-19th century. As some of you already are aware of, as a result of the Napoleonic Wars, Norway went from being a province under Denmark to enter a dual monarchy with Sweden in the year 1814, but the country got its own government, own constitution, and own parliament. The new Norwegian government adopted what you can call a laissez-faire economic policy and urged for abolishing all trade monopolies and regulations. Therefore, they quickly started the process of getting rid of the guild system that had dominated all craft production in Norway for nearly 300 years through a series of deregulations. In the previous centuries, a small group of artisans had the monopoly of practicing a specific craft within a certain geographical area. For example, 10 goldsmiths in Bergen had the monopoly of working with and selling precious metal on the entire western coast of Norway. But due to this gradual abolition of the guild system, anyone was free to become a goldsmith if one wished. This development was, of course, a massive game changer, and Bør's career coincides with this new development. He was admitted as member of the Goldsmith Guild in the year 1815, almost the same year as Norway got its new form of government, and by the time he passed away in 1859, the guilds were stripped of all of their former power. Even though the goldsmiths despaired over this development, Børs quickly adapted to this new reality. For example, he started to advertise in local newspaper for his products. You can see an example of it up there. It says like very pretty gold bracelet, brooches and earrings of the latest fashion sold by Christian Børs, for those of you who are not familiar with archaic Norwegian. And it will not win the marketing campaign of the year at all. But this was in fact a novelty because marketing had previously been forbidden due to the guild's regulation. You were not allowed to compete with the fellow members of the guild for customers. And it was not just the marketing strategies that were changing, but also the mean of production. The Industrial Revolution transformed Norway and the Nordic countries in the 19th century, and the goldsmith profession was in fact the first craft in Norway that became industrialized. One innovation was the introduction of the so-called stamping machine that made it possible to mass produce, as you can see, silver components that could be bought from catalogs such as these and then soldered on to individual objects. You can see one example with the handle on the cream mug up there. Also, machine technology replaced the traditional hammerwork, which of course reduced production time, so silverware became much more available to a larger audience. So to conclude the first objects, the history of modern design in Norway starts at the dawn of this new capitalistic era, where new marketing strategies and innovative technology became essential factors to be successful within the field of design. Another example of this tendency is the oval plate, which you can see here, made by Egersund Pottery Factory in the 1860s or 70s. It's made in earthenware and decorated with a picture of Sandefjord Spa. And the object is a very early example of what you call transfer print in Norway, a technique that Egersund started to use in the 1860s. That was a technique that came from England. They had transformed English ceramic industry in the 18th century, and instead of this time-consuming process of hand-painting motifs on coppery, one could now engrave the motif of a copper plate. You could then print it on a piece of rice paper and then press it onto the ceramic object before firing. And the first kind of transfer print produced by Egersund were based on copper plates imported from England, but later the factory employed their own engravers and developed their own Decaux series. The decoration often consisted of Norwegian cityscapes or sites, as the one example here, and it might seem a bit curious for a modern audience to decorate a piece of tableware with the picture of a medical institution. But at this time, this was actually one of the most visited spas in Northern Europe, and the choice was probably to display how progressive the new Norwegian nation was by depicting its modern institutions. The founding of the pottery factory is symptomatic for this new wave of industries established in Norway in the 19th century. The factory's location on the southwestern coast gave it easy access to rich clay resources and a good harbor. Its goal was mainly to produce cheap and hygienic china to gain maximum profit, not to produce good design. It didn't exist a design profession at this time. But from the product catalogs, we can study the development of the factory's expansions of modern models and patterns, and the introduction of the transfer print technique made lavishly decorated objects not just limited to the upper classes of the Norwegian society. And they also, in the 1880s, launched a new pattern, you can see it up there, which was called the Nordic. That's quite suitable for today's topic. And at first glance, when I saw this in the storages, I thought, okay, this is an example of Viking revival style in Norway from the late 19th century with this kind of stave church-inspired ornaments along the rim. But actually, this was based on a Swedish model, which shows us that the interest in the Nordic historical heritage was not just a Norwegian phenomenon at this time, it was rather a pan-Nordic movement. And the interest in the Nordic past leads me on to the third object, which is one of the best examples of the dragon style I can think about. An enamel Viking ship designed by the Bergen-based goldsmith Marius Hammer, made in a technique called plikkejor enameling. The technique was actually not Norwegian at all. It was inspired by the works of Austrian and Russian goldsmiths that the Norwegian goldsmith firms had seen on the great world fairs at the time. Plikkejor enameling is what you do is that you basically build a kind of cobweb of filigree that is silver thread, and you start to fill in this structure with enamels of different colors. Enamels is basically glass, and of course it can be colored by adding different metal oxides. And of course an object like this requires multiple firings, because you start with the colors that require the highest melting temperature, that is blue, you move on to red, etc., etc. Multiple firings, enamel shatters extremely quickly. So this is a very, very, very complicated technique, but the result is a sort of miniature wonder, which almost looks like stained glass window, all wrapped up in this kind of beautiful longboat ship shape. Hammer's Viking ship is very representative for the search for a national style in the 19th century in Norway. We wanted to create a style which corresponded with the country's national character, a style to represent the nation, so to say. The result was a revival style that looked back to the golden age in the Viking and medieval era, when Norway was an independent and mighty kingdom. And the style debate was of course very interconnected to important events at the time. For example, one started to restore the medieval cathedral of Trondheim, my hometown, to its former glory. One found the three Viking ships, Tune, Gokstad and Oseberg. So suddenly Norwegian history was not just something you read about in textbooks. It was actual physical objects which you dug out of the ground, material proof of the country's proud history. And products in the dragon style inspired by these events became hugely popular, not just on the domestic market, but also among international tourists. During the 19th century, mass tourism began in Norway. You had first the English salmon lords, which came to the country to fish and explore the wild natures, then German and Americans, which resided on floating hotels. That is a 19th century term for a cruise ship. and they traveled along the Norwegian coast. And when they stopped in the small Norwegian villages, you could find souvenir stalls such as this, which almost looked like a staved church, where you could buy these small pellicule enamel souvenirs and bring them back to the home country as something typical Norwegians. I guess that some of you have some of these examples at home. Very popular in the States. Another example where the Norwegian design received international acclaim around 1900 was within the field of textiles. As design historian Peder Valle has pointed out, in design debates in the late 19th century, textiles were perceived as something, a typical Norwegian medium for artistic creation due to the country's long historic tradition for weaving. And by the turn of the century, several prominent artists wanted to translate this tradition into contemporary design, a phenomenon we call the Norwegian weaving renaissance. One of the pioneers of this development was Frida Hansen, originally a haute bourgeoisie from Stavanger who studied traditional dyeing and weaving techniques on the Norwegian countryside and later used this knowledge when she established her own weaving studio in present-day Oslo. Hansen participated in several international exhibits where she received great applause for her textile art, and her work was acquired by many of the prominent decorative arts museums in Europe. Here we can see one typical example of her design, Bluebell. Our edition is from 1901, but she launched this edition at the Paris World Fair in 1900, and they were described by the international jury as a real innovation. What we referred to was Hansen's famous transparent technique, which she developed around 1897. The principle of this technique is actually quite simple. What you do is that you alternate between woven and unwoven passages. Part of the vertical wrap is left unwoven, so the result is a kind of semi-transparent effect, where it is possible to see through parts of the textile, and hence the term transparency technique. But despite Hansen's innovations, both on a technical and on an artistic level, her design was not very well received in Norway at the time. The Norwegian museums of decorative arts were very hesitant toward her. Her choice of style, inspired by French Art Nouveau and German Jugendstil, was seen as not national enough in a country obsessed with dragons and Viking ornaments. Her design was simply too international to fit within a very narrow understanding of what Norwegian design was, and she was nearly forgotten until a Norwegian art historian, Anniken Thue, in the 1970s rediscovered her artistic oeuvre, and today she is considered one of our most important textile artists. Another female pioneer in the beginning of the 20th century was Nora Gulbrandsen, and she's considered Norway's first female industrial designer. In the late 1920s, she was in fact headhunted for the position as artistic director of the Norwegian porcelain factory Porsgrunn, and was given the task to reform the factory's production. One of the results is the vase you can see on the slide here, designed by Gulbrandsen in 1928, decorated with the stylized cross-country skiers in a snow-covered Norwegian landscape depicted in an Art Deco style. And this French style, which also was hugely important here in the US, was introduced in Norwegian design by the end of the 1920s. And historically, the factory had a very established tradition for underglaze painting with pale blue motifs on a white porcelain surface. But here it is combined with the Art Deco's love for strict line, dynamic speeds, and geometrical shapes. Gulbrandsen designed the vase for the Bergen Expo in 1928, where she got her big national breakthrough. The expo had a huge department, which you can see here, to decorative arts, and Porsgrunn's production occupied 5 major podiums in this central hall. As in most of the Western world, national and international expos were very important arenas to promote novelties within the field of design, and Gulbrandsen's love for striking contrast, strong colors, and geometrical ornaments received national applause from the critics. Gulbrandsen stated herself in a later interview that she aspired to make modern porcelain which was simple, functional, with constructive shapes and strict lines. And these characteristics, which clearly resonates with the ideals of the modernistic design, indicates why Gulbrandsen was an early representative of the ideology we call the Applied Art Movement or the Applied Art Association in Norway in the interwar period. The association was established in 1918 as Foreningen Brukskunst and gradually became hugely influential in 20th century Norway. So when I, in the rest of the presentation, use the term applied arts, I refer both to this organization specifically and to the ideology they promoted. The Applied Art Association advocated for a unification between the artist and the industry. Through mass production and mechanization, it will be possible to achieve beauty in everyday life and democratize good design. The association's radical social program was inspired by similar design movements in other European countries after the First World War, among these the Swedish Applied Art Association and the Deutsche Werkbund. Gulbrandsen also co-designed, as you can see here, the cover of the Applied Art Association's journal in 1932, together with a textile artist named Ruth Arnestad. And you can notice that her graphic design shares certain characteristics with her ceramic production, strict geometrical composition and striking color contrast. Another example of Norwegian design from the interwar period is this telephone, the so-called EB1001. And the phone is marketed all over the world as the Swedish model. But it was, in fact, a Swedish-Norwegian collaboration. The product was developed and designed in Norway by the manufacturer Electric Bureau, but produced and distributed in Sweden under the direction of the telephone company Ericsson. It was a Norwegian engineer that came up with the idea of making a phone in cast plastic after he started to experiment with the new material Bakelite. The use of cast Bakelite had several advantages. The production time was reduced dramatically, it was cheap, and it required low maintenance. To design the telephone, they hired a Norwegian painter called Sean Heiberg, and after several tests and failures, the phone was launched for Ericsson's Jubilee in 1932. As the design historian Fredrik Welthagen has pointed out, it is interesting to reflect upon in retrospective that Heiberg's design could have been the example par excellence of the Applied Art Association's ideology. It has a clearly defined shape where form follows functions, and it represented a kind of unification between the industry and an artist. But actually, this innovation received very little attention from the champion of the applied art movement. This illuminates the fact that they had a very conservative understanding of the fields of design. They kind of limited themselves to decorative elite products for domestic use, not the expanding field of industrial design. And this is indeed a paradox at the time where new technology offered cheap and rational solutions to make good design available for the lower classes. Specifically relevant perhaps in a Nordic context when the social democratic welfare state was in the making. But regardless of the Applied Art Association blind spots, Heiberg's solutions set a new international standard for modern telephone design. Unfortunately, it was a bit too modern for Norwegian consumers, as the phone never actually became very popular among regular Norwegians. And a couple of years later, the company actually had to design new models in Bakelite with a more conservative appearance. You can see one example over there from the 1940s. Then we arrived at the golden age of Nordic design, the 1950s to the 1970s, which tends to be summarized in the term Scandinavian design. Often understood as a pan-Nordic variation of modernistic design, described with terms as human, democratic, simple forms, natural materials, a kind of perfect manifestation of the social democratic spirit of the Nordic countries. But just to be clear, Nordic design in the post-war era was much more diverse than just these kind of objects, but I could not hold a lecture here in the US without mentioning Scandinavian design. And in a Norwegian context, two major events that is connected to this term. Both of them took place in 1954. First, it was the opening of the exhibition Design in Scandinavia, which toured the US and Canada for 2 years. It was also, in fact, here in Seattle, and promoted Nordic design to the New World. Secondly, it was the Norwegian debut at the Design Triennale in Milan, and the 7th object, which I have chosen, was shown at this event. What you see is a silver bowl, which is covered with transparent blue enamel, and underneath you can see milded lines, quite expressionistic, made by a tool which is quite similar to a dentist drill. Both the design and the execution was made by Grete Prytz, a Norwegian silversmith and designer that belonged to one of Norway's most prominent goldsmith dynasties. And in the post-war era, the Triennale in Milan was considered the most important international design fora in the Western world. Norway did not participate in the earlier editions of the Triennale in the 1950s, even though the Nordic nature achieved great success. And this reflected the country's position as an underdog with a bit low self-esteem, one might say, within the field of design. When the Norwegian participation in 1954 became a huge international success, it was partly due to the fact that Grete Prytz and her husband, the functionalist architect Arne Korsmo, dominated this exhibition, both conceptually because they were in charge of the entire layout, but also because they had a massive representation of objects they had co-designed for their goldsmith family firm, J. Tostrup. The exhibition was arranged, as you can see here, as a herring table with major silver centerpiece here in the front, and also especially made cutlery, both by Grete Prytz and Arne Korsmo. You can also notice some small oil and vinegar bottles designed by Herman Bungar, and in the background you can see a big blue textile which was made by the Norwegian-Swedish textile artist Hanna Riggen. The main objective with the participation was to promote Norwegian goods and increase the country's international trade. It was said to be a golden opportunity for Norwegian export. But the question is, did this exhibition actually reflect this economic purpose? In his fascinating study, Professor Kjetil Falland at the University of Oslo has analyzed the discrepancies in the rhetoric surrounding the Norwegian contribution and the objects which was actually shown there. As we have seen, this exhibition consisted almost exclusively of unicas and objets d'art, and almost no example of mass-produced Norwegian industrial design. So I think we can say that the Norwegian miracle in Milan is best understood as a successful, very successful, I might add, attempt to razzle-dazzle the international design community with the aesthetics of Scandinavian design. Jumping forward to the mid-1970s, it became evident that the applied arts ideology was in decline. As a result of growing political and artistic awareness, a young generation of craft artists left the National Association of Applied Artists in 1974 and established their own organization, Norske Kunsthåndverkere. And this schism marked the culmination of a growing discontent towards the applied arts ideology over several years. This ideal to unify industry and art seemed rather utopian, since most Norwegian producers were not interested in employing artists to develop beautiful everyday goods. So this new generation of craft artists rather identified themselves with fine artists like painters and sculptors, not as industrial designers. They wanted their products to be considered works of art, not potential prototypes for a non-interested industry. The long-term consequence of these organizational turmoils was the separation between the fields of industrial design and craft, a division that has continued in Norway until the present day. And one member of this new generation of craft artists was the silversmith Tone Vigeland, which is considered a pioneer in Norwegian art jewelry. Here you can see an example of her iconic work from the 1980s, an expressive necklace where you have a pendant consisting in the end of what looks like black feathers, but that is actually hammered steel nails, which Vigeland had then oxidated. Vigeland can actually serve as a very illustrative example of the separation of the fields of craft and industrial design. The starting point of her career was within the framework of the applied art ideology. After her graduation, she became a part of a Norwegian design collective, Plus, in Fredrikstad. As one of 3 members of the silversmith workshop, she produced prototype for small-scale production. You can notice one of them here. And these early works is then characterized by these simple lines, very elegant forms, maybe influenced by the Danish company Georg Jensen or the Swedish silversmith Torun Bulof Hubbe. The sober design from the Plus period was quite popular among consumers, but Vigeland herself became increasingly critical towards Plus' organizational model and gradually decided to pursue her own artistic career. And her aesthetic reorientation came around 1980 when she started to make this kind of sculptural jewelry pieces with very complex form and surprising material combination. She worked all by herself without any help from students or apprentices. The result was wearable art, powerful, expressive jewelry miles away from her production in the 1960s. Silver was still her preferred material, but as you can see, she challenged now the material's quality. She eliminates its shiny surface by polishing or oxidation. And she is very inspired by what we call the new jewelry movement, because she combines always this precious and non-precious material, for example, silver and base metals. She earned herself a great international reputation. Foreign collectors and museums, specifically also here in the US, were super impressed by the piece's extraordinary quality when it comes to craftsmanship and flexibility. She was acquired by Le Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, by the V&A in London, and MoMA in New York. And gradually, her pieces become more and more a crossover between jewelry and sculpture, until she, in the mid-1990s, dedicated herself to make abstract metal sculptures and installation, a tendency that dominated her artistic career until she passed away in March this year at the age of 86. Another area where a Norwegian got an international reputation in the 1980s was within the field of fashion. In the French capital, a Norwegian designer named Per Spook, which had moved to Paris in 1959 and worked for several brands like Dior, Saint Laurent, and Louis Vuitton, had established his own fashion house in 1977. His collection received international praise in the fashion industry, and 3 times he was rewarded the most prestigious French fashion awards. And even the Parisian magazines, which are not known to be very generous when it comes to compliments, called him a great dressmaker. It might be a bit of a surprise to some of you, but I'm quite certain that almost every Norwegian household in the 80s owned at least one piece by this Parisian-based designer. My mother and father had, in fact, one each. What I refer to is this, the so-called Per Spook sweater, which was launched in 1981 and became hugely popular among the Norwegian population. The design was actually a commission from the Norwegian Folk Art and Craft Association, which asked Spook to design a knitting pattern for the 90th anniversary. The result was a huge commercial success. 50,000 knitting patterns were sold. And the sweater's appeal among young Norwegians must be because it represented something distinctly Nordic, but with a flair of continental fashion. As textile historian Anne Kjellberg has pointed out, the pattern itself was not very innovative. The design was based actually on older historical models from Sweden, but the novelty here was just a combination of colors. And the designer's interest for knitwear was not just limited to the so-called Persbuk sweater. In the high-range end of his production, he had already included knitted garments in his haute couture collection already in 1978. They were, of course, not decorated with Scandinavian patterns, but the choice to include this technique on the Parisian runway can be seen as a reference to Spuk's own national background. Regardless of this, also his press advisor understood the potential in using the designer's nationality as an effective marketing tool for his outfit. His Norwegian origins was, in 1980s France, looked upon as almost a bit exotic, and he was then framed as the designer from the far north. Even though most of Spuk's collection were without Nordic references, in around 1990, the designer took the inspiration from his home country to a whole new level. He launched two collections which can be described as a celebration of the Norwegian identity and heritage, which were called the Far North and Nordic Fairy Tales. The theme of the latter, which you can see here, was in fact Norwegian knitting tradition. And here Spuk used knitting in a way never seen before. The garments, which included woolen caps, socks and scarves, were often combined with lavish outfits and untraditional cuts. At first glance, many of these garments seem to be decorated with historical Norwegian knitting pattern, but at a closer inspection, you will see that the patterns was in fact Spuk's own design. The result is a kind of playful and innovative reinterpretation of a Norwegian tradition, and the collection's popularity shows us that Nordic design don't always have to be minimalistic to achieve international success. Then we come to the final object of this presentation. In this case, it is perhaps not accurate to use the term objects, since this example is meant to illustrate an increasing expansion of the field of design towards the end of the 20th century. So the point here is not to show you a porcelain plate from my childhood in the 1990s, but rather an example of what you can call identity design. Because if you look closely, you will notice that along the rim there is stylized figures practicing different kind of winter sport. And this was a part of the design program that was developed for the Lillehammer Winter Olympics in 1994. Norway used this occasion to develop an impressive design program headed by the graphic designer Petter Moshus. The goal was to show the international community what it meant to be Norwegian in a modern world. It also reflected that the Norwegian government at that time, headed by the country's first female prime minister, Gro Harlem Brundtland, had an increasing ambitions for Norwegian architecture and design. One decided that only Norwegian designers were to be involved in the development of the project to show the world what a relatively small nation could achieve, and 4 designers were chosen to be a kind of core group that created the design profile for the Olympics, among these Sara Rosenbaum. In 1991, the core elements of the design program were presented for the public. They consisted of the already seen pictograms inspired by petroglyphs or rock carvings from the Bronze Age found in the north of Norway. The graphic adaptation of the figure, practicing different kinds of Olympic winter sports, gave them a distinct modern feature. The most celebrated of them was probably the torchman, presented in various adaptations on this screen, which became one of the most iconic emblems of the event. The pictograms were very received by the design establishment, but also by the Norwegian audience at that time. I guess some of you already remembers it quite well. And it is beyond doubt that the design program was a key factor in the success of the 1994 Olympics. It contributed greatly to give the Games a recognizable identity and build up the expectations in the years leading up to the 16 days long sport festival. The case really shows us how design at its best can be a very efficient way to express collective values and shape an identity. And the design program contributed greatly to the fact that the Norwegian people could be boosting with pride when the president of the International Olympic Committee, Jean Antonio Samaranch, at the closing ceremony declared the event as the greatest Winter Olympics ever. I just have to say that. And with that, I would like to conclude this lecture on Norwegian design. We have now been traveling by the speed of light, I hope you are not exhausted, from a relatively newly established nation with very little consciousness when it comes to the field of design, through a gradual development of a design profession and a design ideology, until the expansion of this field far beyond its traditional limits in the end of the 20th century. So thank you very much for your attention so far, and I really look forward to the conversation now with Leslie. Thank you.
Thank you for taking us on that journey, told through objects. It was wonderful and illuminating. So you've touched on this at various points, but I might just ask you to characterize how Norwegian design fits in to the narrative of pan-Nordic design or international design. So I'm starting with a very big question for you.
That is indeed a very big question. But of course, this is a discussion about center and periphery, right? Because one might say that Norway, geographically, is in the outskirts of Europe, which has also kept us out of many of the major events of the history of Europe, and that is also true within the field of design. You can also say that within Nordic context, Norway is also a bit in the outskirts. When if I, for example, let's say this morning I jogged along Lake Union here in Seattle, and if I stopped an American, not one of you, because you are very familiar with the Nordic context, but if I stopped an American and asked them, what kind of the Nordic countries do you associate with design? I guess the majority will say Denmark, maybe some will say Sweden and Finland. I think few of them will mention Norway. And of course, that is a fact, but I think also our role with being a bit in the periphery also give us certain opportunities, because we can shed light upon different perspectives, both of the Nordic design history and international design history. For example, the case about how design shapes our identity of being Norwegian. We have touched upon this several times in this presentation: Viking revival style, the debut in 1954 in Milan, the Olympics. But of course, you will find that in every country that one uses design to develop an identity. But what is the difference with Norway is, of course, this happened within a country that for several centuries had been under foreign rules. And I think that story, how we specifically then use design as a way to shape our understanding of being Norwegian, and of course the rest of the world's understanding of being Norwegian, is a good example of how we can contribute to a Nordic, but also to a global history of design. But of course, I can sit here and I can complain and say, oh, we are a bit peripheral and so on. But I also have a responsibility as a curator, and the Norwegian scholars of design has a responsibility. That's why I'm so happy now to see the development in Oslo, because all the literature on this subject is only available to people who read Norwegian. It's very, very limited. Until the recent year, it has been very limited and very not accessible to people, for example, from English-speaking countries, or for French-speaking, or for German-speaking. And I think we also, as museums, we have to make international collaborations, because we sit on this material. So we have to make it accessible for the rest of the world by collaborating with institutions such as you. You have now a collaboration coming up on new Nordic cuisine with the National Museum of Oslo. I think that's such a great opportunity, because you can shed light upon both the Nordic design history of this phenomenon, but also the specific Norwegian contribution.
Thank you. And in 13 months' time, I hope that you'll all join us here at the museum for an exhibition that is pan-Nordic and really examines new Nordic cuisine through the lens of architecture and design. So it's a very exciting exhibition for us to host here at the museum. But your response certainly prepares the next question, which is about Viking revival style, which was significant not only at home, but also abroad. So could you talk a little bit about that and what it might have meant to consumers in North America?
Yeah, of course, the Viking revival style is also a kind of theme that touches on both what can say an international level of design history, a Nordic and a Norwegian, because the search for style was, you'll find that in every country in the Western world in the 19th century, even here in America, where often Roman antiquity was seen as a kind of national style for the American, as a kind of modern equivalent to the Roman Republic. And of course, when Norway started to look at their past, they didn't have any antiquity to look back upon. They couldn't use the Renaissance because that was the time we became a part of Denmark. We actually became a province under Danish rule. We couldn't use the Baroque and the Rococo, still Danish-influenced period. So the choice was then the Viking and the medieval era. And of course, you find that in other Nordic countries as well, as Sweden, with the Gothic League and so on. But in Norway, it got its kind of like own response because of the political context around that time. And it was important as a part of building up a Norwegian identity domestically, but it was also extremely important, as you say, as featuring being Norwegian abroad. Here in America in 1893 at the Chicago Expo, the White City, as some of you are aware of, we had in our expo a pavilion in dragon style containing, for example, carved wooden objects from West Norway in the same kind of dragon style. It became a way to showcase what it was to be Norwegian also for an international community. And of course also with the tourists coming in and acquiring these kind of souvenirs. And I find the case of souvenirs so interesting because what is a souvenir? Yes, it reflects something about the country you are visiting, the culture you are traveling to, but it's also depending on that you, as a foreigner, can understand these codes. And I think we tend to overlook sometimes that in the 19th century Europe, the Nordic heritage was very important. Take, for example, William Morris, the great English design reformator. He was extremely interested in the Icelandic sagas. He translated them to English, had these public readings, etc. So it was not so unfamiliar and exotic as one might think. And I think that also what made an international appeal of the Viking revival. And I just have to mention one more thing, since you are very familiar with this. The Viking revival was extremely popular in Norway way into the 1930s. The champions of this design establishment loaded it. It was the most horrible thing they ever seen. When 1905 was done, they were done with the dragon style. We had now a nation. We didn't need this style of Vikings and dragons anymore. So, but of course, among the ordinary Norwegian, it was extremely popular. So popular that the director of the Museum of Decorative Arts in Oslo in 1932 held an exhibition called Battle Against the Dragon, where he showed this horrible example to scare the Norwegian people of the poor taste of the Viking revival style.
So where do you see fertile ground now in research on Norwegian design?
Yes, that is also a big question. Of course, you have perhaps two ways of doing research. One way is, of course, to do this major monographical studies of certain designers, of certain crafts artists. There are still a few of them that has a story that needs to be made available. For example, Benny Motsfeldt, a Norwegian glass pioneer, which I see that you are familiar with her work, which was extremely important also internationally because she's a kind of transitional figure between a traditional designer who works with designing glass in a drawing table to the early studio glass movement when she actually became involved in the process. She didn't blow the glass herself, but she was in the hot shop, etc. So I think there are certain monographical studies that need to be made, but also to kind of rewrite what is previous studies that has been made. For example, all material before 1800 in Norway, They haven't been doing research on that for almost 50 years. And of course, my generation then has the challenge. We have to see what kind of potential is there, for example, in the older material, or how can we use modern perspective, modern methodology to reinterpret already very familiar narratives. You also said to me yesterday the question about females, for example. In this presentation, there is 50% females. And perhaps one thing is that, okay, but we have a quite fair representation of female Norwegians within the field of design, but they are there for a reason. Nora Gulbrandsen is there because Alf Bø, a Norwegian industrial designer historian in the 1960s, did a major study of Porsgrunn porcelain factory. Frida Hansen is there because Anniken Thue in the 1970s rediscovered her artistic career, etc., etc. So we also have we have to have a commitment to include this kind of new perspective relevant for our time in this kind of research.
And how would you say that the story of women artists differ in the fine arts versus decorative arts and design?
Yeah, that has something also to do a little bit with the fields of design. I tend to say, of course, my fine arts colleague will be furious when I say this, but I sometimes claim it's a bit more complex because you have a designer, you have a maker, etc. A female artist produces usually her own works of art, while, for example, Frida Hansen is a bad example because she knew the entire process. She could follow her textiles from the idea stage until the final products. But within the field of design, usually you have different kind of phases of the production of a product. And I think that to shed light upon these complexities, for example, the enamel Viking ship of Marius Hammer, of course he is a male designer, but the one who filled in the enamel were females, were women. And that we never actually tell people when we display this in our museum. Textile is a bit different. There they have gotten more and more awareness that it is perhaps a male artistic genius who has made the watercolor, which is basically the design, but it is females who have been sitting there actually translating this watercolor into an actual motif which they have executed. And that transition from of a motif from one medium to another requires a huge artistic sensibility. And I think we need to acknowledge that, both in the labels in the museum, let's start with something basic at that, but also in the scholarly literature.
So your story was told through objects in your collection, and we had a rich conversation yesterday about collecting practices currently. And could you talk a little bit about representing Sami art and design in Norwegian collections?
Yes. Of course, there are several ways into this. I would say that specifically Sami art and Sami contemporary crafts has gotten very much increased attention in the recent year. It's partly due to that they have been featured also in the international art scene, for example, Documenta. And we see that the Norwegian museums of art and design are increasingly interested in contemporary Sami art and craft. Design is not perhaps the best example, but I found it very interesting that in 2020, during the pandemic years, some of you are probably aware that the Norwegian state gave the museums a huge amount of money to buy contemporary art, design, and crafts for our collection. It was not to be nice to us, it was to stimulate the artistic economy because the artists were really struggling. And of course, the museums were free to use this money for whatever acquisition they wanted, as long as it was contemporary and as long as it was Norwegian. And a lot of them acquired Sami crafts and Sami art. And I also see now, for example, in Oslo, in the new National Museum, they have a huge exhibition now on a Sami textile artist, Britta Markatlaba, which really was the blockbuster of the year. Everyone was talking about it. You can see like a huge amount of audience coming into this exhibition and really like diving into this specific culture and how it's also very relevant for them within our contemporary art scene and a contemporary craft scene. So it's really interesting to see, and I think this development will continue in the years to come.
And I should note that we recently displayed her work as part of an exhibition called Arctic Highways, and was easily mentioned as a favorite in the exhibition. So she has a growing audience here in Seattle as well. So I'll end with a big question. In what direction, or in which direction, do you see Norwegian design going? Are there any exciting collaborations that you've been looking at, for example?
That is also a very big question. The one thing I can say for certainty is that I'm not the best prophet in the world. I will probably be wrong. But of course, I guess that if you see the field of design, one thing which is not specifically Norwegian, I think you see it in many countries, is that design has taken now the step away from the domestic sphere into the public sphere. You can see it very well, for example, in Oslo, when you have had these huge public building programs in the last decades. Of course, we in Bergen are very angry about that, because we also want a part of the public building programs. But of course, you have the new National Museum, you have the wonderful Opera House, you have the Oslo Public Library, and I find it all interesting, because you can see there how relevant design is to those projects. It is not just the architecture, they are very well designed. So it's like marvelous to go into them and just to enjoy and get the impression of what's going on in Norwegian contemporary design right now. Also, which is a challenge, at least for me as a curator, is that the design field has now developed far beyond the traditional border. It has become, of course, design is no longer things. You have web design, you have communication design, you have a very expanding design field, which of course causes huge challenges for us as a museum. Because how are we, we have been working with this field since 1887, and how are we going to document this development for future generations? Of course, the museums were founded as institutions in the 19th century as a kind of encyclopedia of things, and suddenly we don't have things anymore. And everybody who has had an old computer knows how hard it is to preserve what's on it for future generations. So that is going to be, I think, the biggest challenge of my generation. When it comes to like collaborations, what do we have? We have actually now a quite interesting collaboration with the University of Copenhagen and the University of Bergen, which is going to be our summer exhibition next year. And it's about Nordmannsdalen. That is a small series of dolls made in Bergen in the 18th century by a postman. It sounds very, very weird. It kind of is. They were sent to the king in Copenhagen as a gift. The king became very enthusiastic. He ordered a German sculptor to make a huge edition of these dolls, which represented different kind of Norwegian dressed in local costumes in a great sculptural garden outside of Copenhagen. And then the Royal Copenhagen Porcelain Factory mass-produced the kind of small figurines of these sculptures, and they were super popular and quite well known in Norway because they were seen as a very early documentation of the bunad, of the national folk costume. So we are trying to now bring together all these sort of mediations of this series, which started in Bergen and also shows very much light upon pan-Nordic networks, because it is a thing made in Bergen, sent off to Copenhagen, translated into stone, translated into porcelain, circulated around, important because it shaped the Norwegian image of what costumes look like, but we are trying to cast a new light upon it, because they are not just wearing these folk costumes, they are also holding attributes like fish, wood, etc., which is a way to display the resources of the Danish-Norwegian crown. So it's a sort of economic cartography, if you would like. So that is our interesting collaboration I look forward to. So come to Bergen next summer.
Well, thank you so much, Morten, for the invitation. And thank you for coming all this way to Seattle and sharing your expertise.
It has been so great being here. I hope you have enjoyed it. I could talk for hours and hours about this. And thank you so much for the generosity. It has been a real pleasure for me to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.